In the summer of 2006, a survey expedition mapping the floor of the Baltic Sea off the coast of Poland caught a massive shape on their sonar. Resting on a seabed roughly 87 meters down, with its highest surviving structures rising to about 60 meters below the surface, was a colossal wreck approximately 850 feet long. It was heavily armored, marked by empty casemates once intended for heavy surface guns, and distinctly designed with a massive flat deck to carry aircraft. This was the Graf Zeppelin, Nazi Germany's only aircraft carrier, and the most ambitious surface vessel the regime ever put into the water. Built to support German surface raiders with reconnaissance, fighter cover, and striking power, the Graf Zeppelin was intended to become a terrifying force multiplier in the North Atlantic. She was given cruiser-grade protection and an incredibly complex mechanized launch system. But the Graf Zeppelin never fought. She survived the entire Second World War without launching a single aircraft in anger. Her demise was not the result of a massive fleet engagement or a catastrophic tactical blunder at sea. Instead, her greatest enemy proved to be the toxic bureaucracy, the shifting priorities, and the bitter internal rivalries of the very government that demanded her construction. How did an 85% complete superweapon, representing millions of Reichsmarks and immense industrial effort, end up as a paralyzed floating warehouse? To understand how Germany's blue water ambition was strangled from within, we have to look back to 1933, when a resurgent German Navy realized its future fleet had a fatal vulnerability. In the mid-1930s, the leadership of the Kriegsmarine stood before a map of the North Atlantic and confronted an impossible mathematical reality. Admiral Erich Raeder, the commander-in-chief of the German Navy, knew that if war ever broke out with Great Britain, his fleet would be vastly outnumbered. A direct clash of battleships in the North Sea would be suicidal. If Germany was going to project power, it had to rely on a strategy of blue water commerce raiding. Commerce raiding was an asymmetric war of attrition. Instead of fighting enemy warships, fast, heavily armed surface vessels would break out into the open ocean to hunt merchant supply convoys. By sinking the freighters carrying food, oil, and steel, German raiders could systematically starve the British island economy. But Raeder recognized a fatal vulnerability in this doctrine. A lone German battleship prowling the mid-Atlantic was blind beyond its immediate horizon. More terrifyingly, the Royal Navy already operated a formidable fleet of aircraft carriers. The British did not need to catch a German raider with battleships. They only needed to find it with scout planes and launch a strike. A single aerial torpedo could cripple a propeller or jam a rudder, leaving the mighty raider paralyzed in the open ocean until the British guns arrived to finish it off. To survive the Atlantic, the German surface fleet needed its own mobile umbrella of air cover. It needed its own carriers to provide eyes in the sky to find the convoys, and fighters to shoot down British torpedo bombers. The political path for this vision opened in 1935. The Anglo-German Naval Agreement allowed Germany to construct a surface fleet up to 35% of Great Britain's total tonnage, including an allowance of 38,500 tons for aircraft carriers. That agreement cleared the way for two projected carriers, including Flugzeugträger A. Plan Z came later, at the end of the decade, expanding Hitler's naval ambitions long after the first carrier had already been designed and ordered. Hitler assured Raeder that a naval war with Britain would not happen before 1944. This assurance was the foundation of Raeder's entire strategy, a promise that would soon prove completely worthless. It was the first sign of a toxic dynamic that would plague the carrier project, where the Navy's greatest threat was the impulsive political nature of its own government. But for now, Plan Z gave Raeder the mandate and the budget he needed. Raeder ordered the construction of two fleet carriers, intending to divide the treaty allowance into two 19,250-ton hulls. The lead ship was designated simply as Flugzeugträger A, Aircraft Carrier A. The requirement was set, and the strategic logic was sound. But the Kriegsmarine immediately slammed into a wall of its own inexperience. No German shipyard had ever built a true aircraft carrier. The Navy had no operational carrier doctrine, no veteran aviation designers, and no domestic blueprint to copy. To turn this desperate strategic requirement into a physical reality, the Navy's construction office assigned the preliminary design to Wilhelm Hadeler and a small technical staff. In April 1934, the task of defining Germany's first dedicated fleet carrier fell to the 36-year-old assistant to the professor of naval construction at the Technical University of Berlin. At 36 years old, Hadeler was an assistant professor of naval architecture at the Technical University of Berlin. He was a brilliant theorist and a meticulous draftsman, but he faced an impossible constraint. How could an architect engineer a functional aircraft carrier through theory and observation alone? In Great Britain, the United States, and Japan, carrier design was an evolutionary process driven by spilled blood and bent metal. Years of operational trial and error at sea had taught foreign navies how wind curled over a moving flight deck, how heavily landing gear absorbed impact, and how to balance hangar space against hull stability. Hadeler had none of this. Germany had no carrier pilots to consult, no dedicated aviation doctrine to guide his parameters, and zero institutional memory to draw upon. Hadeler was forced to build his warship out of borrowed blueprints. He began by obsessively analyzing whatever intelligence the Kriegsmarine could gather. He studied espionage reports, maritime photographs, and published naval registries detailing the British carriers HMS Furious and HMS Courageous. He calculated the basic geometry required for a fleet carrier: a massive internal hangar to store the planes, a long, unobstructed flight deck for operations, and an island superstructure offset to the starboard side to house the command bridge and vent the boiler exhaust away from incoming aircraft. A major breakthrough came in the fall of 1935, when a German technical delegation was permitted to inspect the Japanese aircraft carrier Akagi. In a rare moment of technological cooperation, the Japanese also provided approximately 100 detailed plans of the ship's flight deck apparatus. Hadeler eagerly integrated this windfall of data into his own emerging design. However, relying on observation rather than operational experience created a dangerous trap. When a designer copies a foreign blueprint without understanding the tactical reality behind it, they inevitably inherit its mistakes. When Hadeler studied the Akagi, he noted that the Japanese carrier carried heavy, cruiser-caliber guns in low casemates along the hull. But Graf Zeppelin's own heavy battery was not merely a copied detail. German planners expected the carrier to operate with limited escort and demanded enough surface firepower to defend herself against enemy cruisers, eventually approving 16 15-centimeter guns. The choice remained a serious design trade-off. The guns consumed weight, crew, ammunition space, and internal volume, while some firing arcs could interfere with activity around the flight deck. But the battery was not simply a proven Japanese mistake that Hadeler had copied without understanding. It reflected a German doctrine that still expected the carrier to defend herself in a surface engagement. Despite the steep learning curve, the academic architect succeeded in his primary task. By 1936, Hadeler and his expanding design team had drafted a viable, mechanically coherent blueprint for a massive blue water carrier. He had proven that German industry could theoretically engineer the whole, but an aircraft carrier is not a standalone warship. It is a hybrid weapon system. Hadeler's steel blueprint meant absolutely nothing without a specialized, highly trained air wing to fly from it. And in the deeply fractured command structure of Nazi Germany, the planes did not belong to the Navy. They belonged to a man who viewed the entire project as a direct threat to his own power. How can a Navy build an aircraft carrier if the Air Force refuses to provide the aircraft? All military aviation remained under the jealously guarded authority of Hermann Göring's Luftwaffe. As the head of the Luftwaffe, Göring operated under an absolute decree. Everything that flies belongs to me. He resisted an independent naval air arm because it would weaken Luftwaffe control over military aviation, turning a strategic requirement into an institutional power struggle. Admiral Raeder repeatedly pleaded with the High Command for a dedicated aviation branch, arguing that fleet carriers required specialized squadrons operating under unified naval authority, much like the American and Japanese systems. But Göring had immense political capital and refused to cede control over aircraft development, slowing aircraft allocation, conversion, unit organization, and the preparation of specialized carrier pilots. Even so, experimental catapult work, arresting trials, and the formation of units intended for carrier service did move forward. The physical consequence of this bureaucratic blockade manifested in the aircraft themselves. Rather than allocating resources to develop a clean-sheet, purpose-built naval fighter designed from the ground up for the brutal stress of carrier landings, Göring forced the Kriegsmarine to accept navalized versions of existing Luftwaffe land planes. The primary fighter assigned to the ship would be the Messerschmitt Bf 109T, with the T standing for Träger, or carrier. Adapting the Bf 109 was a severe technical compromise. It was a brilliant land-based interceptor, but a terrifying aircraft to land on a pitching wooden deck. It possessed a notoriously narrow undercarriage that made it highly prone to tipping over, and a long nose that completely obscured the pilot's forward visibility during a carrier approach. Engineers added an arresting hook, catapult fittings, structural reinforcement, and an enlarged wing, but they could not change the fundamental geometry of the narrow landing gear. The Bf 109T's wings did not fold, although they could be detached for transport. Furthermore, the Bf 109T offered limited endurance compared with some purpose-built carrier fighters, restricting how far the ship could extend a sustained umbrella of air cover. How severe that limitation would have proved in operations was never tested at sea. While foreign navies were developing rugged, long-legged fighters, the German Navy was shackled to a land plane inherently unsuited for the open sea. The strike aircraft offered an even more absurd physical compromise. The Navy was assigned the Junkers Ju-87C, a navalized variant of the infamous Stuka dive bomber. The Stuka featured fixed, non-retractable landing gear. If a pilot missed the carrier and was forced to ditch in the ocean, those fixed wheels would catch the water and violently flip the aircraft over, trapping the crew. To solve this, engineers had to install complex explosive bolts to literally blast the landing gear off the plane mid-flight before a water landing. Together, these compromises left the planned air wing dependent on modified land planes poorly matched to carrier operations. Yet, in the face of this political paralysis, the naval architects pressed forward. By late 1936, Hadeler's finalized blueprint revealed a ship that had radically departed from its original treaty limits. The initial treaty calculation allowed approximately 19,250 tons of standard displacement for each of two carriers. As the design evolved, Graf Zeppelin grew to roughly 24,500 tons standard, and approximately 33,550 tons at full load in her final projected configuration. This massive bloat was the physical consequence of asking a single question. What happens when you design an aircraft carrier to fight like a surface raider? Hadeler therefore pushed the design to a heavy, armored extreme. He designed the carrier with an astonishing 16 15-centimeter or 5.9-inch surface guns, housed in armored casemates along the sides of the hull. This gave the vessel the broadside firepower of a frontline light cruiser. To protect the deep magazines feeding these guns, Hadeler had to install a 100mm thick armored belt along the waterline, wrapping the ship in a shell of heavy steel. The immediate advantage was undeniable survivability against surface gunfire, but the trade-off deformed the ship's primary purpose. The battery and its protection did not alone force an immediate widening of the hull. The stability bulges came later, when radar, command facilities, additional armor, reinforcement, and heavier anti-aircraft armament pushed the accumulated wartime modifications beyond the original stability margins. Furthermore, housing the ammunition hoists, the armor, and the gun crews devoured massive amounts of internal volume. As a consequence of the entire internal arrangement, the narrow hangars, surrounding workshops and accommodation, elevators, gun spaces, and aircraft handling machinery, this enormous carrier was expected to operate only about 33 to 43 aircraft, depending on the design stage and proposed air group. By comparison, several contemporary fleet carriers of comparable dimensions operated substantially larger air groups, although national practices for deck parking, reserve aircraft, and the counting of operational machines differed sharply. The Graf Zeppelin was a carrier that had sacrificed half its striking power simply to carry a cruiser's guns. The internal space was further compromised by a brilliant but catastrophically over-engineered solution to the launch problem. Hadeler's team knew that launching heavy, modified land planes like the Bf-109T from a short deck would be incredibly dangerous, especially in the tight, unpredictable waters of the Baltic and North Sea, where turning the massive ship perfectly into the wind was not always possible. The choice was to install a highly mechanized launch system, 2 pneumatic trolley catapults. Instead of hooking an aircraft directly to a shuttle, the German planes were hoisted onto heavy-wheeled carts, or trolleys. A massive compressed air system would then blast the trolley down a track built into the flight deck, throwing the aircraft into the sky. The advantage of this pneumatic system was speed. The catapults could theoretically launch a rapid burst of aircraft, even without ideal wind over the deck. But the compressed air reservoirs were finite. Roughly 18 aircraft could be launched in quick succession before the system required a lengthy recharge of approximately 50 minutes. But the cost was staggering mechanical complexity. Once the aircraft lifted away, its trolley remained locked to the catapult's moving slideway, rather than racing freely down the deck. The slideway retracted into the catapult track, after which the trolley was released, pushed onto a recovery platform, and lowered to the deck below. From there, it was rolled through the return rail system and brought back into the handling cycle for reuse. This trolley bottleneck ate up even more of the precious internal volume that should have been used for storing aircraft and aviation fuel. The German engineers had attacked the launch problem with a beautifully complex machine, but whether that machine could have been maintained through saltwater exposure, battle damage, and sustained combat operations remained dangerously unproven. The theoretical blueprint was now finished. It was a massive, armored, mechanically dense paradox, an aircraft carrier terrified of being an aircraft carrier. On December 28, 1936, the keel of Flugzeugträger A was laid down at the Deutsche Werke shipyard in Kiel. For the next 2 years, thousands of shipwrights, welders, and engineers labored to build the massive hull. Millions of Reichsmarks and vast quantities of high-grade steel were poured into the dry dock. The sheer scale of the construction was staggering, producing a massive steel elephant that dwarfed almost everything else in the Kriegsmarine's naval registry. Construction also had to account for the harsh physical geography of Northern Europe. Because the carrier would frequently need to transit the restrictive confines of the Kiel Canal to reach the North Sea from the Baltic, Hadeler's team had been forced to solve a severe maneuverability problem. The massive, heavily armored hull could not reliably navigate the tight canal locks using traditional rudders alone, especially under crosswinds. The designers installed 2 retractable Voigt-Schneider cycloidal propeller rudders near the bow, giving the ship unusually precise, low-speed control during docking and movement through confined waterways. While this brilliant addition allowed the giant vessel to maneuver delicately through narrow waterways, it introduced yet another highly complex, mechanically vulnerable system into a hull already packed with intricate plumbing and heavy artillery. The culmination of this staggering industrial effort occurred on December 8, 1938, In a massive public spectacle designed to broadcast German resurgence to the world, the hull was formally launched. Adolf Hitler stood on the reviewing stand, watching as the colossal vessel slid down the slipway into the gray waters of the Kiel fjord. In a moment of supreme political irony, Hermann Göring delivered a ceremonial address at the launch, while Countess Hella von Brandenstein-Zeppelin, daughter of Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin, formally christened the ship. To its audience, the Graf Zeppelin seemed to represent a terrifying new era of German blue water supremacy. Following the launch, the Graf Zeppelin was moored for the exhaustive fitting-out process. Over the next year, the intricate internal machinery, the heavy 15-centimeter surface guns, the turbines, and the massive island superstructure were steadily installed. The thick timber planks of the flight deck began to be laid down over the steel framework. By September 1939, the ship was approximately 85% complete. But that figure concealed how much remained. Final fitting out, commissioning, sea trials, flight deck trials, air group integration, and the development of an operational carrier doctrine. Hadeler's armored Leviathan was far advanced as a hull, but it was still a long way from becoming a fully effective warship. But as the countdown to war accelerated, German naval procurement was about to change drastically. In September 1939, Adolf Hitler's political assurance to Admiral Raeder evaporated. The war with Great Britain had arrived 5 years earlier than the German Navy had been promised. Suddenly, the strategic paradigm that justified Plan Z collapsed, raising a fatal question. What happens to an unfinished aircraft carrier when a nation can suddenly no longer afford a surface fleet? The Graf Zeppelin had been designed for a methodical, heavily resourced blue water campaign. But the outbreak of the Second World War triggered a ruthless industrial reality. The massive steel elephant sitting in the dry docks at Kiel was devouring thousands of tons of high-grade metal, miles of copper wiring, and the irreplaceable labor of expert shipwrights. It was an industrial luxury the Reich could no longer sustain. Wartime priorities increasingly favored the U-boat campaign, which offered Germany a weapon that was already in production and already attacking British supply lines. Dönitz strongly advocated expanding the submarine force, but there was no simple equation by which one partly completed carrier could be converted into a documented number of operational U-boats. At a naval conference in late April 1940, Raeder himself recommended stopping work. The ship still lacked critical equipment, completion remained distant, and the newly occupied Norwegian coast urgently needed heavy guns. Hitler agreed, and construction came to a halt by May. The swarm of shipyard workers vanished, reassigned to submarine pens and repair docks. But the physical humiliation of the ship was only just beginning. Those same 16 15-centimeter guns now became prime candidates for wartime recycling. In a brutal dismantling of the apex predator, the heavy cranes that had once carefully lowered the casemate guns into the hull now violently ripped them out. The heavy artillery was shipped north to Norway, embedded deep into concrete bunkers, and used as static coastal defense batteries. The Graf Zeppelin was permanently disarmed before she ever fired a shot at sea. Though Hitler impulsively ordered work to resume in 1942, the project was functionally dead. By early 1943, following a series of humiliating defeats for the German surface fleet in the Arctic, an enraged Hitler ordered all large surface ship construction abandoned. After repeated clashes with Hitler, Raeder asked to be relieved and was replaced by Dönitz at the end of January 1943. New work on major surface ships was halted, confirming the submarine campaign as the Navy's central priority, although Dönitz later resisted Hitler's demand to scrap every surviving operational surface unit. To protect the hollow hull from Allied air raids, tugboats towed the massive ship out of Kiel and dragged it between various Baltic ports. The enormous internal hangar deck, specifically engineered by Hadeler to house modified Messerschmitts and Stukas, complete with the incredibly complex pneumatic trolley return rails, was put to use as a literal floating warehouse for the Navy's hardwood timber supply. The Graf Zeppelin survived the entire war at sea precisely because she never went to sea. But by the spring of 1945, she was a rusting, rotting monument to strategic failure, anchored in the freezing waters of the River Oder, waiting for the arrival of the advancing Soviet army. The destruction unfolded in stages. In late March 1945, with Soviet forces approaching, the ship's maintenance personnel removed key valves and flooded the engine and boiler spaces, settling the unfinished carrier into the shallow mud. Then, on April 25th, as Soviet troops reached the Stettin area, a German demolition unit placed charges in the machinery spaces. Their detonation wrecked the power plant and drove the hull more firmly into the riverbed, seemingly ending the story of Nazi Germany's carrier ambition. But the ship had one final, brutal trial to endure. When Soviet forces captured the area, they found the deliberately scuttled Leviathan and began a detailed examination. Over the following months, salvage teams sealed accessible leaks, pumped out the flooded spaces, and repaired enough of the damaged hull to refloat it. By March 1946, the carrier had been raised and towed to Świnoujście for further inspection and disposal planning. In 1947, under the Soviet designation PO-101, usually translated as Floating Base Number 101, the ship was prepared for final disposal. Reports differ over precisely what equipment or captured cargo remained aboard when she was towed from Świnoujście into the Baltic. It was no longer a prestige weapon designed to conquer the Atlantic. It was a ghost ship, deliberately positioned for destruction. Beginning on August 16, 1947, the Soviet Navy subjected the empty hull to a staged series of weapons tests. Charges were detonated at selected positions, aircraft dropped bombs, and naval weapons were fired against the ship before torpedo boats were ordered to deliver the final attacks. Here, in a final stroke of historical irony, the Graf Zeppelin actually worked. The staged tests showed that the incomplete hull could absorb substantial punishment, but they did not prove Hadeler's structural calculations perfect. Internally placed charges and aerial bombs caused less damage than the Soviets expected, and the carrier remained afloat until torpedo attacks opened the hull below the waterline. After the second torpedo struck, Graf Zeppelin sank in approximately 23 minutes. Her resistance reflected armor, watertight subdivision, reserve buoyancy, the incomplete internal fit, and the sequence and placement of the weapons, not armor alone. While the ship was systematically blown apart in the Baltic, its chief architect quietly survived the collapse of the regime. Wilhelm Hadeler transitioned back into civilian life, returning to his original roots as a scholar, author, and naval historian. He lived a long, quiet academic life, dying in 1987. His personal survival stood in stark contrast to the violent, explosive demise of his greatest engineering challenge. Ultimately, the Graf Zeppelin did not revolutionize naval warfare or spark a global arms race like other famous warships of its era. Its historical consequence was instead a costly negative lesson. Redirecting its resources might have strengthened other programs, including submarine construction. But no responsible calculation can show that this would have severely altered the early Battle of the Atlantic. More importantly, the failure of the Graf Zeppelin showed that carrier power depended on a dedicated aviation command, specialized pilots, logistical support, and a cohesive military strategy. The German High Command possessed none of these, dividing its resources between competing institutions and shifting political promises. Today, the massive wreck rests in the dark, silent waters of the Baltic Sea. Her heavy casemates are empty, her complex catapult rails lead nowhere, and the wooden planking that once covered her flight deck has largely vanished, leaving the battered steel structure beneath. She remains frozen in the deep, a permanent record of an aircraft carrier that never became an operational warship.